having a COP in Brazil is an opportunity to demonstrate how climate-based solutions can have a fundamental role in tackling the environmental crisis.
We really are altering our planet's chemistry. Last year was also the very first single year in which global average temperature rose more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
Hey everyone, we are excited to launch a new podcast series in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, The Road to COP30. Throughout September, we'll be speaking with leaders from the Nature Conservancy across Latin America to explore their work ahead of COP30, taking place this November in Pará State, Brazil. On this episode, we're looking ahead to COP30, a pivotal climate summit that will take place in Brazil, marking the return of global climate negotiations to Latin America. Joining us are two leading voices from the Nature Conservancy, Paula Caballero, Regional Managing Director for Latin America, and Marcio Sztutman, Executive Director for Brazil. Together, they share why COP30 represents more than just another climate meeting. It's an opportunity for Latin America to showcase solutions, elevate local leadership, and drive action on a global scale. Join us as we explore what's at stake, why it matters, and the role the Nature Conservancy has in shaping the road to COP30. This is the first episode of the series, and we're sitting down with two leaders for the Nature Conservancy, Paula Caballero, the Latin American Regional Director for the Nature Conservancy, and Marcio Sztutman, the Executive Director for TNC Brazil. I want to thank both of you for coming. Before I kind of ask for both of you to give kind of your background as well as talk about your roles, I do want to give a brief on our series as a whole. This is episode 1. We're kind of going to talk about COP30, some previous COPs and the Nature Conservancy's role. But going from there, we also have episodes on the role of traceability in combating deforestation, community-led conservation of freshwater and fisheries, building a socio-bioeconomy in the Amazon, providing access to direct funding to indigenous peoples, and then lastly, rethinking carbon markets, looking at the private and the public sector, all this coming together, going into COP30, which is actually going to be in Brazil this year. So yeah, thank you both for joining us. I'll ask you first, Paula, could you give an introduction to yourself and the work that you do with the Nature Conservancy?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation on behalf of TNC, the Nature Conservancy. I'm the Regional Managing Director for Latin America for TNC, which means that I help manage and run the programs that we have from Mexico all the way down to Chile. I have a pretty varied background. I've worked with the UN, I've worked with the World Bank, I've worked with the Colombian government, I've worked with other NGOs and think tanks. And what excites me about working at TNC is that I think that with TNC, we can work at the scale and at the speed that these converging planetary crises demand. And something that I would highlight very much about TNC is that we're not simply looking at conservation in isolation. We really are about sustainable development. We're about co-creating and finding win-win solutions with all manner of stakeholders, meeting what they are and finding solutions, co-creating solutions, so that we can ensure that the natural resources, that the amazing habitats, that the water and lands of Latin America are protected, but also that they are productive in ways that are sustainable so that they can serve us now and into the future and safeguard the incredible biodiversity that our region hosts.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And then Marcio, if you want to give a little introduction and talk about your work with the Nature Conservancy.
Well, thank you so much, Preston, for the opportunity for being here with you today. And I'm a biologist by training. I'm a botanist, and I have always worked towards conservation and sustainable development, mostly in the Amazon region. I started my career in small consultancies, ended up moving towards state governments in the Amazon. I've worked for TNC for 14 years, and then I left to the private sector, working with businesses and impact investing. And I've returned to the Conservancy earlier this year, 2025. And as an executive director for Brazil, I help to implement, design, monitor, and showcase the work we do to conserve the Amazon, Cerrado, and Atlantic forests, which are three key biomes in South America.
Well, yeah, again, thank you both for being here. The first kind of question I'll ask both of you, so you can both answer this is, why is it a series like this that we're doing? Why is it so important leading up to COP30? Again, it's in Brazil. We're featuring leaders from the Nature Conservancy in Latin America, as well as the global team. So can you talk about why it's so important to get the voices out and the voices to be heard about the great work that the organization is doing?
Marcio, you want to give it a first shot?
Yeah, so the mission we carry, it's tremendous. We really want to save the planet, want to save the biodiversity, water, the food production, the species that exist out there in the forests and the rivers. And we cannot do that without a very broad constituency. So to share the message, to congregate more people around the COP30 objectives and all the COP's objectives, including the biodiversity one, is just crucial. And we understand the debate of environment has created a huge momentum, but there's so much more to be told about success stories, about opportunities, about the risks of not action. So to disclose that message as broad as we can, as to build a coalition as broad as we can, is just essential to our mission and actually to the planet itself.
Yes. And I would compliment what Marcio is saying that, as I was saying before, we're not really about just conservation. We're looking at sustainable development more broadly. And the only way that we're going to really be able to tackle the climate crisis and all the other crises that are associated with it is by really being able to create solutions, mobilize the kind of finance you need for a much broader agenda, an agenda with many different stakeholders, different governments, private sector, public sector, finance, find themselves and understand what their role is and how they can contribute to this, and how the lack of action is also creating incredible risks for them. This is no longer an environmental agenda. This is an agenda that is very much a social and economic agenda, because the fact is that we're already seeing the very palpable impacts of climate change on supply chains, on coastal communities, on communities. We're seeing extensions of wildfires. We're seeing huge droughts and at the same time floods. So we see this sort of growing tempo of all of these different impacts. And the good news is that we can still act, but the reality is that we have to act pretty fast. So moments like COP30 become a galvanizing moment, as Marcio was saying, to really husband all of the will, the political and the capital needed to be able to change how we're consuming, how we're producing, how we're valuing what we have today and what we need to have, the kinds of natural assets we need to have in the future. And it's really important that we understand this as an integrated agenda and not as, if you'll excuse me, because you're called the Green Podcast, but that we're the Green Hour, that it's not seen as just a green agenda, but an agenda that benefits and is important for everybody. And I think that is TNC's role. Because we're so muscular, we have so much expertise, we can show, as Marcio was saying, all kinds of different solutions and responses that resonate with many different stakeholders and contexts and geographies.
So as we kind of look back and see how we got to where we are today, Paula, I mean, we were connected, I think, in 2023 during Climate Week in New York City, and we actually had a conversation in the past on the podcast about, how integral you were in building the SDGs. And in that conversation, we talked about Rio+20 and how that was such a critical point in sustainable development. So as we start talking about COP30, how we got here, I did just want to ask you if you could talk a little bit about Rio+20, how that plays a role in the overall climate conversation, as well as sustainable development, and how that's kind of led us on this path to where we are now at COP30.
Thank you. That's actually a really interesting question, Preston, because the Rio+20 was where the nest, if you will, the genesis of the Sustainable Development Goals. And many people still see a divider that Sustainable Development Goals, or if I can use the acronym SDGs, are somehow separate or different than climate. And they're one and the same agenda. Because the reality is that in order to tackle climate, what do we have to do? Change our food systems, energy transition, think about our cities, our heating, our energy efficiency in many different ways. The way you tackle climate change is through a very integrated, more rational, if you will, development agenda. And that's exactly what the SDGs are about. The SDGs look at how we can better manage our energy, our education, our water, our intellectual property, you name it. It's bringing everything to the fore so that we can think about these holistic solutions. So what happened in Rio in 2012 is really critical today because the degree to which we understand the need for holistic solutions to really tackle decisively the climate crisis that we're in is going to be very relevant. But I would say something else that is really critical, and I'm sure Marcio will speak about it too. I don't want to steal his thunder, but I just want to talk about Brazilian leadership. What happened in Rio was a very, very contentious and very complicated negotiation that had gone on for about 6 months. And when those negotiations all the negotiators arrived in Rio in June of 2012, it seemed an unsurmountable task to be able to come up with an actual agreement on anything. And yet, Brazilian diplomats, through the incredible capacity that they have for finding where the consensus lies, for bringing people together, for understanding different interests, in other words, being the extraordinary negotiators that they are, were able to pull it off and get agreement. And you know what? Those same people, many of the people who were of the Brazilian diplomats who were in the room in Rio guiding those negotiations, I'm happy to say are right now in the driver's seats for COP30. I know them all, many of them, on a first name basis because we were, as I like to put it, in the trenches, in the negotiation trenches for many, many years through many COPs. And I know that Brazil has its diplomacy has a capacity to deliver levels of ambition and consensus that might be very difficult for other countries. So that also, I think, is a big lesson from Rio Plus 20. It's just the primacy, how compelling Brazilian, or decisive is a better word, how decisive Brazilian diplomacy can be.
And kind of pivoting off of that, I will tell the listeners here that if you're interested in, having a deep dive into those conversations that were had, Paula's book, actually, I think it's called Redefining Development. Isn't that what it is? Yes.
Yes.
Redefining Development is a great book that kind of talks through the whole process of how conversations even started for what we're calling the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a really, really good book. I think I bought my copy on Amazon. So if you want to learn more about Rio Plus 20 and the whole climate kind of negotiations, everything that happened, definitely check out that book for sure.
Thank you, Preston. And if I may add, it's now open source. So you can actually go to the publisher and download it for free. So that's even better yet. And you can read the story of Rio Plus 20 and the SDGs there.
Well, Marcio, I do want to kind of turn the conversation to you for a second and looking specifically into Brazil and Brazil's and the significance of COP30 returning to Latin America. I think we were talking in the beginning, COP had been in Latin America maybe a few years back, but it's back in Brazil. And I just would ask you the question, what's the significance of it coming to such a large country in Brazil, in Latin America, where, so much of, I would say, carbon storage happens with the Amazon rainforest?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I would start answering by saying that symbols matters, and the COP30 is taking place in perhaps one of the most symbolic ecosystems in place in the planet, the Amazon. The Amazon is as known as anything in the planet. So having that sort of negotiations in an arena in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the people that live in the forest, is really, really strong. Sends a very clear message of the emergency, of the need to find large-scale solutions. And it's a symbol for a reason, right? It's so essential for climate regulation. So the Amazon, it's really vital in terms of carbon stock, in terms of carbon sequestration, and we can have a place that describes better the urgency of the agreements we're looking for. There's also, the Brazilian diplomatic skills, as Paula has just indicated. So we're not only in a very symbolic place, but we have very competent people leading the process, bringing together international alliance. But it also offers opportunities to Brazil, who has been a leader in solutions of nature-based solutions, if you will, for years, to showcase those successes to the world, so they can deliver greater impacts in other countries. So having a COP in Brazil is an opportunity to demonstrate how climate-based solutions can have a fundamental role in tackling the environmental crisis, both by maintaining the forest stand, but also by regrowing old areas that used to have forests and they have been lost, and also in terms of sustainable production. So we have track record, for instance, where deforestation has dropped 80% over a period of 10 years, and at the same time, the agriculture and ranching production increased almost double. So we can demonstrate in practice that it is possible, that we don't have a conflict among development and conservation. Quite the contrary, one is dependent on the other. And also, after a number of conference of parties of the climate having taken place in countries whose economies were driven by oil and gas, and not so much democratic countries, if you will, we have a COP in a country where the economic power comes from the rural areas and fully democratic. So it adds another layer of participation. So we do expect very strong community presence at the COP by design, and that may favor as well the reaching agreements to become easier and faster. That's the plan. I would hope that might happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would ask, either one of you, if you want to answer this, but, I know every COP, there is an overall theme that's kind of presented and kind of followed. So I would be curious. I'll be honest with you, I haven't looked into it too much in depth, but to learn about, what are those key outcomes? I think, Marcio, you talked about it a little bit, in your answer right there, but what are some of the main goals of COP30? I know in past COPs, people have gone in and they were hopeful that agreements would be made. They were hopeful that, things would get accomplished, but are there any sorts of things like that happening this year? What are some of the goals, as let's say, global community, going into COP30?
I would say there are three major results that are expected, and people are working around those for COP30. First one, it's a clear plan to phase out of fossil fuels. That's one. Two, to ensure we have much greater capital flow towards transitioning our economy, transitioning the way we produce, transitioning the way we generate energy. And finally, to build climate resilient societies, empowering local groups and ensuring the well-being of the people by adequate, not only mitigation, but also adaptation towards climate change, because we know some of the changes are now already irreversible.
And if I can build on what Marcio is saying, I think that we need to take a step out and see where we are right now. And I'm just going to give listeners two pieces of information that I think are really relevant that highlight why this COP is so decisive. Last year, in 2024, for the very first time, that had the highest atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide in the last 2 million years. So in the last 2 million years, these concentrations have never been so high. We really are altering our planet's chemistry. Last year was also the very first single year in which global average temperature rose more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole explanation of 1.5, but let's just say that 1.5 is, if you will, a symbol, a marker, a referent for the kind of limits that we need to put to the increase in global temperatures to avoid the most catastrophic events. And what we agreed just 10 years ago in Paris is that we would do our level best as a global society to avoid reaching that essentially tipping point of 1.5. And we've reached it. So we're already, science is telling us that we're not in a really good place right now. And that's really important. So building and maybe digging a little bit more into what Marcio was saying, one aspect that is really important is that countries increase the ambition in their climate commitments. So back in Paris, and actually it started before when in a COP that was held in Warsaw, the negotiators came up with this idea of a nationally determined contribution. And that very technical term just means that it's the commitment that each country takes to say, I promise that I will do X, Y, and Z to contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Put very simplistically. It's more complicated than that, but at its most essential, these NDCs, as they are called, these commitments, are what countries like their pledges. And the way the architecture of the climate change, of the Paris Agreement, of the climate change framework convention is structured, is that there's going to be every 5 years an opportunities for we call them parties because they're parties, but countries, to increase the ambition to say, okay, I started out saying I would pledge to this, but clearly it's not enough. So now that I've figured out how to do this, how to do it more inexpensively, solar, for example, has gone down in price, I can ratchet it up to this. Or I'm going to include now other sectors that I hadn't included, like agriculture. So countries are called, it's called the ratchet mechanism, this idea that every so often, in fact, every 5 years, countries are going to increase the level of their ambition. That is something that we want to see, is that countries are committing to, are really not only just increasing their ambition, but delivering on what they have committed. And that is critical because if countries don't do that, then we're not going to be looking at exceeding the 1.5 degrees. We're going to start moving into 2 degrees. And we already know the catastrophic impacts of 1.5. Imagine 2 degrees. So that is really important. We need to really have really clear direction in the COP on how we're going to implement these NDCs and live up to something called the global stocktake, which is, if you will, a scientific assessment of a stocktake of where we are on climate action and where we need to be. And we're way off, and we have to move forward very quickly. So figuring out how to do that is really critical. Another very important point has to do with the whole deforestation, and that's the issue around and nature-based solutions. The best technology for addressing climate change are trees. That it's proven, it's tested, it's cost effective. And the fact is that on a good year, forests and other vegetation absorb about 30% of all the carbon that we're emitting. So they're our friends. We emit and they help keep it down. But last year, there were so many fires as a result of human activity, but also because of many of the dynamics of climate change, that forests are now absorbing less carbon. So instead of forests being part of the solution, they start to become part of the problem because they're emitting more gases because of forest fires. So we start to see these sort of feedback loops that are really not good. So addressing deforestation and forest degradation and changes conversion of land use, which is what is so powerful of what Marcio was saying about having this COP in the Amazon, that's another critical point. But I would say that probably, Preston, the make or break is that we really need very strong and credible science that finance will be scaled up. There's climate finance right now, there's huge gaps of about $300 billion. And what we've called for is that what has been identified is that we need 1.3 trillion per year by 2035. We're not there yet. And in the past, when we've signed up, the international community has signed up to meeting certain financial targets, they have not been met. And that has created a lot of ill will within the negotiations. And so we really need to have these really credible and clear signs that finance will not just be scaled up, but at the pace that is needed to have a breakthrough at COP30. And this means it's not just financial assistance, what is sort of official development assistance, developed countries helping developing countries. That is a very important part of it. But that's not going to meet the 1.3. So we also need to look at how we look at concessional finance, how we look at innovative funding mechanisms. And Brazil has put forward some really interesting idea. Debt solutions, because there's a debt crisis that's ongoing also. So there's many a lot of work going on many fronts on the finance side, but that is also going to be really, really critical.
So one question I'll ask, just because kind of a follow up, and I think it'll help the listeners a little bit. The Paris Agreement, it's a voluntary pledge that countries around the world can sign on to. And you mentioned these NDCs. Then you mentioned the $1.3 trillion per year that would be needed to kind of meet these targets. My mind, because I'm obviously in the U.S., I'm sitting here in like the Atlanta, Georgia area. The U.S. is actually not signed on to the Paris Agreement. And obviously, the U.S. is one of the biggest economies in the world. We could really help to get to that number of 1.3 trillion per year. So in a COP, is there any discussion on how you could get countries that aren't signed on to something like the Paris Agreement involved to kind of help that funding gap and that finance gap that's kind of present if we do want to meet this $1.3 trillion, per year number?
Right. Well, look, I don't think that anybody who's involved in the climate negotiations would question the fact that it was unfortunate. It didn't contribute to the momentum that the convention is looking for, that the U.S. withdrew from the climate agreement. But I do think that there's incredible momentum at state level, and I think there's incredible momentum from private sector actors. Because the reality is that private sector is understanding that there are what you can call climate risks that are embedded in their own operations. So, for example, a global food company is starting to see that their supply of different ingredients that they need for their products, for example, cocoa or vanilla, is being affected because the places where these products are grown are being affected by drought or by floods or by changing temperatures that reduce productivity. So the private sector is starting to realize very clearly that there are climate risks that need to be addressed in any case, regardless of what a government's position is, because it's hurting their bottom line. You're seeing that, and you're not just seeing that in the ag sector, you're seeing that in other sectors. On the energy transition side, you're also seeing a lot of opportunities. So regardless of governments, I'm not saying that government and public policy doesn't affect. Of course it does, and it can. But you're also seeing that in a state like Texas, for example, it's the leader in the U.S. in terms of renewable energy, solar and wind. Why? Because it makes economic sense. Right. So there's also, I think, market dynamics that we should not underestimate. And as I say, that 1.3 trillion, yes, government action is important, but probably even more important will be also how we engage the finance sector, how we engage multilateral banks, for example, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. And they're all stepping up really powerfully also, because they also appreciate that this is something that is central to their work. I would just say that we talk a lot about mitigation, but adaptation is the other side of the coin. And the fact is that, for example, a lot of the investments that the World Bank has made over decades, they can be undermined if we don't tackle climate change, if we don't increase resilience. That's why Marcio was saying that one of the really important outcomes of the COP is to help advance and build climate resilient societies. So it's, as I say, it's not just an environmental issue. It's not just a government issue. It's going to take every single living human on this planet in one way or another. All governments at different levels, private sector, public sector, academia, the list goes on, to get behind this agenda. But Marcio, I'm sure you have, as a Brazilian, a lot of other thoughts about this.
No, I think you're very precise. Perhaps one point we didn't dig much into is the connection among climate and biodiversity. There is a crescente momentum, if you will, to combine those topics because they are indeed deeply interconnected. So this interrelation is also being a crucial focus of the COP by the leadership of Brazil again. And the COP organization or the presidency have created a number of circles, which are working groups or broad collaboration among multiple countries. For instance, there is the local communities and indigenous people circles that are discussing how that very important stakeholder should take more active voice and have access to resources and are being treated fairly. There's a circle of finance that is focused exactly on unlocking the 1.3 trillion, which gathers the ministries of finance of multiple countries, and each one of them bringing solutions. For instance, there's a large initiative called Tropical Forest Forever Fund that aims to mobilize many billions of dollars to ensure the existing tropical forests that are standing continue to be standing in the long run. So there are multiple related initiatives that are being articulated by those circles that are in conjunction helping to get to Belém in the right point with the right proposals and the right momentum.
And just invite you, sorry, Preston, but I think, Marcio, maybe you can also speak a little bit about Indigenous people and local communities' direct access to finance, and also the bioeconomy. These are two areas that I know that you and I have talked about a lot.
Yeah. So maybe our listeners don't know, but in the Amazon, around 20% of the entire basin belongs to indigenous people. That's a huge area. That's roughly 5 times the size of Germany as a country that belongs to indigenous people. And these areas are the best protected and they hold huge amount of carbon. Yet, if you check the amount of money they are receiving to ensure that service, to ensure that protection is maintained, it's very small, it's minimal. It's like less than 1% of the overall climate finance that exists globally. So a key request of indigenous people, which we strongly support, is to increase the funding that is directed towards them to ensure the protection of the territories. And not only that, but that IPLC, indigenous peoples and local communities, can access directly those resources without many intermediaries, as is the case today, because they have been educated formally in the past many years. There are many indigenous lawyers, there are indigenous economists, so they have all the competencies and they have their own institutions. We have seen the birth of many indigenous funds, financial funds in the Amazon in the past few years. So this claim of direct access to finance, we believe is fully legit and one of the best strategies actually to halt greenhouse gas emissions.
I did want to note to that point on indigenous people and groups. Last year during Climate Week, we spoke with Namante Ninkimo, the leader of the Waorani people, and it was very, interesting to hear her perspective and kind of fighting against, big oil and, just for indigenous rights. So I think, the people, you said 20% of the basin is controlled by indigenous people. They know the land better than anyone. They've been there for generations and generations. We understand how important the Amazon is for carbon sequestration across the entire globe. So it's like, it makes too much sense to just allow them access to do what they're great at, and that's manage that area. I would ask, I think the listeners understand now about COP30, what the expectations are, what the goals are, what we're trying to do. But the Nature Conservancy specifically, I am curious about what the organization is going into what the organization's role is, the priorities, key initiatives. Marcio and Paula, if you both want to kind of tackle this together and talk about, what are some of those priorities for the Nature Conservancy, at this conference?
Yeah, I can start saying some key recommended actions that we're aiming to take, starting with ensuring the implementation of ambitious national determined contribution, as Paula mentioned before, is the time when those contributions will be revisited. We want them to be very ambitious because the sum of all countries' NDCs must be able to deliver the impact the planet needs. So ensure we have ambitions on new NDCs. To deliver the $1.3 trillion. Last COP took place in Baku, and there we could not find as a society a solution for the financial gap. So we have created as a society again what we call the road from Baku to Belém, which is how to close the gap of this huge financial needs to transform our society. So we are very focused as well on bringing innovative financial solutions to close that gap. We desperately need, and that's a key agenda, to halt deforestation and forest degradation. So we have a number of successes on how to do that. We want to showcase that and make sure these sort of solutions are available for decision makers. Also, the way we finance and the way we procure food production. So a big chunk of natural habitat loss today comes after agricultural expansion. And there are ways to produce more sustainably. There are ways to corporations that deal with food to procure their goods in a more sustainable fashion. So that's another key action. There's, as Paula said before, the direct access to finance from IPLC groups, indigenous and local communities. That's a key flagship of the Nature Conservancy, especially on that COP. Why? Because we're in the Amazon. And as we have just said, 20% of that area belongs to indigenous groups. So there will be a very strong presence of them there, and we're supporting them to have a strong voice during the negotiations. So these are some of the priorities. There are a couple of more. But in short, these are key aspects that the Conservancy is looking for. And again, that fits in within that framework I've laid out before, which is 1, phase out of fossil fuel, 2, increase finance, and 3, build climate resilient societies. And Paula, please compliment me.
Done a really great job of summing it up. I would say another aspect that we look forward to a lot of progress in Belém and the COP is to really scale up action on loss and damage. Loss and damage is that part of the convention that addresses particularly the most vulnerable states of what happens when you can't. It's not possible to adapt anymore. You're a small island state. And sea level rise means that your land will be inexistent in X number of years. You can't adapt for that. There's no way that you can continue to live there. That's an extreme example, but the whole conversation around loss and damage has sort of moved forward in fits and starts, and we're looking to seeing a lot more momentum around that. Another aspect is around the bioeconomy, which for us really is looking at how we can incorporate nature-based solutions into the processes, productive processes. We also look a lot at what we call the social bioeconomy, which are value chains that are trying to ensure that more value stays in the other territory with communities. It's sort of shorter value chains, but it can also go to looking at much bigger bioeconomy, but to ensure that it's done in a way that is sustainable. That, for example, expansion of soy happens in degraded lands and doesn't continue to push out and to convert otherwise pristine land. So these are other areas that we have a long track record working in and that we're going to be looking there. You ask about TNC, and I would say TNC has a really strong presence in Latin America. We've been here for over 40 years. in the state of Pará, which is where the COP is going to be. There's no other NGO that I think has a longer presence there. A lot of other NGOs are now and organizations are working there now, but we were there when nobody was there. We really were charting the path and helping work in Pará when it was really a hotbed of deforestation. And so we've been on the journey together with the government and the people of Pará. I think we have really long-standing and very trust-built relationships with many Indigenous peoples and local communities with their organizations. For many projects, for many initiatives, TNC's their trusted partner. And I'm really proud of that about TNC. And one of the things they always say is that TNC has always worked with them and not for them. We've really just been partners. Marcio mentioned that we had helped to establish funds owned and led by Indigenous peoples. And that's just maybe one example. And I think that TNC is also really has a good track record in aligning private sector. Again, this is unless a private sector really sees a value add for themselves and understands what their role is. And by private sector, I also include the finance sector. We're not going to achieve any of these ambitions. We need more ambitious commitments by governments, as both Marcio and I have said, but private sector also has to step up very powerfully. And we have co-created and worked on solutions that make sense and now are driven by private sector. And I think that is another element that's really, really important. We help align the synergies between climate, biodiversity, the SDGs, productivity, competitiveness, because you can't remain competitive in a world that has so many climate risks unless you're adapting and unless you're really stepping up to address the climate challenge. So on all of these fronts, in addition to the programmatic priorities that Marcio mentioned, I think TNC can really bring huge value add to COP and to the work that we're doing. But I will close by saying this, Preston, that the most important aspect of TNC's work, and what I think, if I can speak for you, Marcio, makes us the most proud, is that we operate through what we call radical collaboration. No matter how big, how much money, how much influence any organization has, or any bank has, or anybody has, the challenges ahead are so complex that we can only do this. We can only address them by working together. And that's what TNC is really good at, working with everybody, oftentimes working behind the scenes. We're not there to take credit, but we are there for impact, for lasting, effective, durable impact. And, as it's been said, it takes a village, and TNC understands that, and that's our DNA.
So the final thing I'll leave the audience with here, I think this conversation, I think everyone understands that the time to act is now. We need a lot of solutions to come in COP30. But I did want to note, since we are in July, Earth Overshoot Day was this past week, and Earth Overshoot Day marks the date when humanity's demand on ecological resources exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in a given year. This year is calculated to be July 24th, 2025. So this means that July 24th onward, humanity will be living on ecological credit, depleting natural resources faster than they can be replenished. So to leave it with the audience, it's like these sorts of things with how much resources that we're using, how much we're not able to kind of regenerate these things. We need to act now. In conversations that happen at COP, organizations like the Nature Conservancy, these are the groups that come together that actually act and help us, reverse kind of the damage that we've done as humanity. So Paula and Marcio, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time. I'm really excited about this series and diving into all these topics as we get into the road to COP30.